Hello and welcome to Deep Documentary. Today, we journey back to one of the most dramatic, complex, and ultimately tragic episodes in the long and bloody saga of the medieval Crusades, the Second Crusade, which lasted from 1147 to 1149. This is the story of kings and popes, of faith weaponized into armies, of political ambition dressed in the garb of holy war, of spectacular failures and surprising regional victories, of a world torn between Christianity and Islam, between feudal loyalty and religious zeal, between the ambitions of Europe's greatest monarchs and the harsh realities of war in one of the world's most contested regions. The Second Crusade was not merely a military campaign. It was a geopolitical earthquake that reshaped the Latin East, altered the balance of power between the Crusader states and their Islamic neighbors, and set the stage for the eventual loss of Jerusalem itself. To understand why it happened, how it unfolded, and why it failed so catastrophically, we must go back not just to the fall of Edessa in 1144, which triggered the Crusade, but to the very foundations of the Crusader world itself. The world before the Second Crusade. Chapter 1. The Legacy of the First Crusade. To understand the Second Crusade, one must first understand what the First Crusade achieved and what it left unfinished. In 1095, Pope Urban II stood before a vast crowd at the Council of Clermont in France and delivered one of the most consequential speeches in human history. He called upon the warriors of Christendom to take up arms and march to the Holy Land, to wrest Jerusalem from the hands of the Seljuk Turks, and to aid the beleaguered Christians of the Byzantine Empire. His words ignited a fire that would burn for 2 centuries. The First Crusade, launched in 1096, was an extraordinary military and religious phenomenon. Tens of thousands of knights, infantry, pilgrims, and hangers-on set out from Western Europe on a journey of thousands of miles to the Holy Land. Against all odds, against the vast distances, the brutal heat, the unfamiliar terrain, the constant threat of starvation and disease, and the fierce resistance of Turkish and Egyptian armies, the Crusaders succeeded. In July 1099, they stormed Jerusalem and captured it in a massacre that shocked even contemporary observers. The city's Muslim and Jewish inhabitants were slaughtered in enormous numbers. The streets, by some accounts, ran with blood. The victorious Crusaders established what historians call the Crusader states, 4 Latin Christian principalities carved out of the Muslim-dominated Middle East. 1. The county of Edessa, the first and most vulnerable, established by Baldwin of Boulogne in 1098 in the region of modern southeastern Turkey and northern Syria. 2. The Principality of Antioch, centered on the ancient city of Antioch, modern Antakya, Turkey, established by Bohemond of Taranto in 1098. 3. The County of Tripoli, established by Raymond IV of Toulouse along the Syrian coast, centered on the city of Tripoli in modern Lebanon. 4. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, the crown jewel of the Crusader enterprise, encompassing Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Nazareth, and much of the Holy Land, established under Godfrey of Bouillon and later his brother Baldwin I. These 4 states formed a fragile Christian enclave in the heart of the Muslim world. They were surrounded on almost all sides by Islamic powers, the Fatimid Caliphate to the south in Egypt, the various Seljuk and other Turkish principalities to the north and east, and a patchwork of smaller Muslim rulers throughout the region. They depended heavily on continued support from Europe in the form of men, money, and supplies, as well as on the military prowess of their resident knights and the logistical support of the Italian maritime city-states, Venice, Genoa, and Pisa, who controlled the sea lanes and provided vital naval support. For the first half-century after the First Crusade, the Crusader states managed to survive and even occasionally expand, thanks to a combination of military skill, political cunning, and the fortunate disunity of their Muslim neighbors. The Islamic world in the early 12th century was fractured, divided between the Sunni Seljuk Turks and the Shia Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt, and further subdivided among dozens of local rulers, known as Adabigs and Emirs, who frequently fought each other as readily as they fought the Franks, as the Muslims called all Western Christians. But this comfortable disunity would not last forever. The rise of powerful, unified Islamic leadership was only a matter of time, and that time was approaching. Chapter 2. The Crusader States in the early 12th century. By the 1130s, the Crusader states had developed into something resembling a permanent colonial society, albeit a militarized and religiously charged one. Jerusalem was a proper kingdom with a functioning feudal hierarchy. The city itself had been repopulated with Christian settlers, many from the West, but also local Eastern Christians, Armenians, Syrians, and even some converted Muslims. The old Muslim and Jewish populations had been largely expelled or killed. In their place came pilgrims, merchants, and settlers from across Europe. The Crusader kingdoms developed their own distinctive culture, a fusion of Western European feudalism, Byzantine administrative practices, and local Levantan customs. The Franks, as the settlers came to be called collectively, regardless of their actual national origin, adapted to the climate and geography of the region in ways that sometimes shocked newly arrived visitors from Europe. They wore lighter clothing, adopted local dietary habits, bathed more frequently than their European counterparts, and even maintained trade relationships with Muslim merchants. Military orders, the Knights Hospitaller, officially the Order of St. John, and the Knights Templar, played an increasingly important role in the defense of the Crusader states. These were monastic military organizations. Their members took religious vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but spent their lives in combat rather than in monasteries. They garrisoned key fortresses, escorted pilgrims, and provided a professional military backbone that the Crusader kingdoms desperately needed, given the constant shortage of fighting men. The political life of the Crusader states was complicated and often turbulent. Succession disputes, conflicts between the powerful barons and the crown, rivalries between the military orders, and tensions with the Byzantine Empire all contributed to an atmosphere of constant political instability. The kings and princes of the Crusader states were perpetually struggling to balance the competing interests of their vassals, the church, the military orders, and their European patrons. Despite all these challenges, the Crusader states survived and even thrived in some respects during the first decades of the 12th century. The Kingdom of Jerusalem reached the height of its territorial extent under King Fulk of Anjou, reigned 1141–1143, who added Banias near the headwaters of the Jordan and strengthened the kingdom's fortifications along its borders. But ominous signs were appearing on the horizon. To the north and east, a new and dangerous power was rising. Chapter 3. The Rise of Zengi, Islam's Avenger. Imad ad-Din Zengi was born around 1085, the son of a Turkish military commander who served the Seljuk Sultan. He rose through the ranks of the military and political hierarchies of the Islamic world with ruthless determination, becoming the Adabig, regent or lord of Mosul in 1127 and of Aleppo in 1128. From these two great cities of northern Iraq and Syria, he built a powerful state that threatened both the Crusader principalities to the west and the rival Muslim rulers of the region. Zengi was a man of contradictions. He was cruel and violent. Contemporary sources, both Muslim and Christian, describe his savage punishments and his willingness to execute subordinates on a whim. But he was also a brilliant military commander, a capable administrator, and a shrewd politician. He understood that the key to power in the Middle East lay in unifying the fractious Muslim principalities of Syria and Iraq under his banner, and he pursued that goal with relentless energy. He also understood the propaganda value of holy war. By presenting himself as a champion of jihad against the Christian invaders, he could rally religious sentiment to his cause and justify his conquests of fellow Muslims as necessary steps toward the ultimate goal of driving the Franks from the Holy Land. This was, in many ways, a cynical calculation. Zengi spent as much time fighting other Muslims as he did fighting Crusaders, but it was politically effective. Zengi spent much of the late 1120s and 1130s consolidating his power in northern Syria. Fighting against the Byzantine Empire, the county of Tripoli, and various Muslim rivals, he besieged Damascus repeatedly, though the city managed to maintain its independence through a combination of its own military strength and occasional alliances with the Franks of Jerusalem, a remarkable example of realpolitik in which Muslim and Christian rulers cooperated against a common enemy. By the early 1140s, Zengi's ambitions had turned increasingly toward the Crusader states themselves. He saw an opportunity in the county of Edessa, the northernmost and most vulnerable of the 4 Crusader principalities. Chapter 4: The County of Edessa, the Vulnerable Giant. The county of Edessa was, in many ways, the most unusual of the 4 Crusader states. Unlike Jerusalem, Antioch, and Tripoli, which were coastal or near-coastal territories, Edessa was entirely landlocked, a vast territory stretching across the upper Euphrates region, cut off from the sea and from easy reinforcement by the other Crusader states. The city of Edessa itself, modern Şanlıurfa in southeastern Turkey, was an ancient and historically significant place, one of the earliest cities to adopt Christianity and home to important relics and religious traditions. But its strategic situation was precarious. It was surrounded on 3 sides by Muslim territory, and its population was a complex mixture of Armenians, Syrians, Greeks, and a relatively small Frankish ruling class. By the 1140s, the county was in a weakened state. Its long-ruling count, Jocelyn I, had died in 1131, and his son Jocelyn II proved to be a far less capable ruler. Jocelyn II was described by contemporary chroniclers as lazy, pleasure-seeking, and politically incompetent, more interested in the comforts of his court than in the rigorous demands of ruling a frontier county surrounded by enemies. He spent much of his time at Terbessel, modern Tilbashar, a city to the west of Edessa, leaving the county's eastern territories dangerously underdefended. Zengi watched this decline with predatory patience. In late November 1144, with Jocelyn II away from Edessa and the city's garrison weakened, Zengi struck. Part 2: The Fall of Edessa and the Call to Crusade. Chapter 5: The Siege and Fall of Edessa, December 1144. The Siege of Edessa began on November 28, 1144. Zengi brought a massive army, estimates vary, but it was certainly far larger than the garrison that Edessa's Armenian and Frankish defenders could muster. The city's walls were ancient and formidable, but they could not compensate for the shortage of defenders. Zengi's engineers and sappers were the decisive factor. They excavated tunnels beneath the city's walls and propped up the tunnels with wooden supports. When the time came, they set fire to the supports, causing the tunnels to collapse and bringing sections of the city wall down with them. On Christmas Eve, December 24, 1144, a date of profound symbolic significance for Christians, the walls of Edessa were breached. Zengi's forces poured through the gaps and overwhelmed the defenders. The fall of Edessa was a catastrophe of the first order for the Crusader world. It was the first time a major Crusader city had fallen to Muslim forces. The psychological shock was enormous, both in the Latin East and in Europe. Contemporary chroniclers describe the event with horror and anguish. The Archbishop of Edessa, Hugh, was killed in the crush of fleeing civilians. Many of the city's inhabitants, both Frankish and local Christian, were killed or enslaved. Zengi, to his credit, showed relative restraint toward the Eastern Christian, Armenian, and Syrian population of Edessa, recognizing that they were not his primary enemies and that their goodwill was politically useful. But the Frankish population suffered greatly, and the city's churches and religious institutions were damaged or destroyed. Jocelyn II, who had been at Turbessel when the siege began, attempted to organize a relief force, but it arrived too late. He recaptured some outlying territories but could not retake the city itself. Edessa, the first Crusader state to be established, had become the first to fall. The news of Edessa's fall spread rapidly across the Christian world. In Rome, Pope Eugenius III received the news with horror. In the courts of France, Germany, and England, kings and nobles were confronted with the reality that the Crusader enterprise, the great achievement of the previous century, was under existential threat. The question was, what would Christendom do about it? Chapter 6. Pope Eugenius III and the Call to the Second Crusade. Pope Eugenius III, born Bernardo Pignatelli, was in many ways an unlikely man to launch a crusade. He had been a monk at the Cistercian Abbey of Clairvaux, a student and disciple of the great Bernard of Clairvaux, before being elevated to the papacy in 1145. He was a pious and reform-minded pope, but he lacked the political experience and personal authority that a major crusade would require. Furthermore, Eugenius was in a difficult position politically. Rome itself was in turmoil. The citizens of Rome, influenced by the radical reformer Arnold of Brescia, had established a commune and driven the pope from the city. Eugenius was effectively a pope in exile, governing from outside Rome and dependent on the support of secular rulers for his political survival. Despite these challenges, Eugenius acted decisively in response to the fall of Edessa. On December 1, 1145, he issued the papal bull *Quantum Predecessors, one of the most important documents in the history of the Crusades. This document formally called for a new crusade to the Holy Land, offering spiritual indulgences, remission of sins, to those who took up the cross, and providing detailed regulations for the conduct of crusaders and the protection of their property and families during their absence. Quantum Predecessors was remarkable in several ways. It was the first papal crusade bull to offer a full plenary indulgence, complete remission of all penances for sins, to crusaders who participated with sincere devotion. It also explicitly referenced the First Crusade and the heroic deeds of the Crusaders' ancestors, appealing to family honor and dynastic pride as motivations for participation. And it specifically addressed the fall of Edessa and the threat to the Crusader states, framing the crusade as both a defensive and an offensive enterprise. Initially, the response to Quantum Predecessors was disappointing. Eugenius had directed the bull primarily toward France, but the French king, Louis VII, was preoccupied with his own political difficulties. The bull had to be reissued in March 1146 before the crusade truly gained momentum. The crucial turning point came when Eugenius enlisted the help of the most powerful and influential religious figure in Europe, not the Pope himself, but a Cistercian monk from Burgundy whose moral authority exceeded that of any living person. Chapter 7. Bernard of Clairvaux, the architect of the Crusade. Bernard of Clairvaux was perhaps the most remarkable figure of 12th century Europe. Born in 1090 into a noble Burgundian family, he had joined the Cistercian monastery of Cîteaux in 1112, bringing with him a group of 30 companions, including several of his own brothers. 2 years later, he founded the Abbey of Clairvaux, which under his leadership became one of the most influential monasteries in the Christian world. Bernard was a man of extraordinary personal charisma, fierce theological conviction, and remarkable organizational energy. He was an ascetic who drove himself and his monks to extremes of physical deprivation in pursuit of spiritual perfection. He was also a brilliant writer, a compelling preacher, and a political operator of the First Order, who became involved in virtually every major controversy of his age: theological disputes, papal elections, the reform of the Church, and now, the Crusade. Pope Eugenius commissioned Bernard to preach the Crusade in France, and Bernard accepted with characteristic determination. His first major opportunity came on March 31, 1146, Palm Sunday, at Vézelay in Burgundy, where King Louis VII of France had convened a great assembly. The event at Vézelay was one of the great set pieces of medieval history. A vast crowd had gathered so large, according to the chronicler Odo of Duel, that no building could contain them, and Bernard had to preach from a wooden platform in the open air. He spoke with passionate intensity about the fall of Edessa, the suffering of the Christians of the Holy Land, and the duty of Christian knights to take up the cross in their defense. The effect was electrifying. King Louis VII came forward to receive the cross, the symbolic gesture of commitment to the crusade, and the crowd surged forward to follow him. Bernard had prepared a supply of crosses to distribute to those who took the crusading vow, but the demand was so great that he reportedly tore his own monk's habit into strips to make additional crosses. From Vézelay, Bernard embarked on a preaching tour of France and the Rhineland that lasted for months, drawing enormous crowds wherever he went and generating a wave of crusading enthusiasm that swept through the nobility and common people alike. His letters, which he sent to rulers and communities across Europe, were masterpieces of persuasive rhetoric, combining theological argument, emotional appeal, and practical instruction. One of the most significant events of Bernard's preaching tour came when he traveled to Germany to preach the crusade to King Conrad III of Germany. Initially, Conrad was reluctant. He had his own political problems to deal with and was not eager to leave his kingdom for a distant military adventure. But Bernard, in a famous incident, confronted Conrad directly at a Christmas assembly in Speyer in 1146. According to the chronicler Otto of Freising, Bernard delivered a dramatic speech in which he imagined Christ appearing to Conrad at the Last Judgment and asking what more he could have done for Conrad than he had already done, and what had Conrad done for him. The emotional impact was overwhelming, and Conrad took the cross on the spot, to the joy of the assembled crowd. With the two greatest monarchs of Western Europe, the King of France and the King of Germany, committed to the crusade, the enterprise had achieved a scale and legitimacy that far exceeded any previous crusading effort. Chapter 8: The Wend Crusade Violence Against Jews. Before we continue with the main crusade narrative, we must address one of the darkest chapters associated with the crusading movement: the violence against Jewish communities that accompanied the preaching of the Second Crusade. As enthusiasm for the crusade spread through the Rhineland in 1146, a radical Cistercian monk named Radolf began preaching his own version of the crusade message, one that included virulent anti-Semitism. Radolf argued that before Christians set off to fight Muslims in the Holy Land, they should first deal with the enemies of Christ in their midst, the Jewish communities of the Rhineland, who had lived in cities like Cologne, Mainz, Worms, and Speyer for centuries. The sentiment was answered by violence. Jewish communities in Cologne, Mainz, Worms, Speyer, Strasbourg, and other cities were attacked by crusading mobs. The violence was not as catastrophic as the massacres of the First Crusade, partly because Bernard of Clairvaux intervened personally to condemn Radolf and defend the Jews. Bernard traveled to the Rhineland specifically to counter Radolf's preaching. He confronted Radolf directly, forced him to return to his monastery, and issued letters and sermons insisting that Jews must not be harmed, not out of any modern sense of tolerance, but because Bernard argued, following established church teaching, that Jews must be preserved as witnesses to Christianity, and that they would ultimately be converted at the end of time. The Jews are not to be persecuted, killed, or even put to flight, Bernard wrote in one of his letters. Bernard's intervention was partially successful. He managed to stop the worst of the violence in some areas, but his efforts could not undo the damage already done, and Jewish communities throughout the Rhineland suffered significant losses of life and property. This episode is a reminder that the crusading movement was not only about distant wars in the Holy Land. It also unleashed waves of religious violence closer to home, targeting the most vulnerable minorities in European society. Chapter 9. The Wendish Crusade, a Northern Front opens. One of the most remarkable features of the Second Crusade is that it was not a single expedition to the Holy Land. It was a multi-front enterprise that simultaneously targeted Muslims in Spain and pagan Slavic peoples in northeastern Europe. At the Diet of Frankfurt in March 1147, the assembled German princes and clergy debated the question of who would go on crusade and where. Many of the German nobles had little interest in the distant and expensive journey to the Holy Land. They had enemies much closer to home, the Slavic Wends who lived east of the Elbe River, on the borders of German settlement. These peoples were still largely pagan, and their raids into German territory were a constant source of conflict. Bernard of Clairvaux, ever the pragmatist when it came to the Crusade's goals, offered a theological justification for a campaign against the Wends. He wrote to the German princes that fighting the pagan Slavs was as meritorious as fighting the Muslims in the Holy Land, as long as the goal was their conversion or their extermination. Conversion or annihilation, in his stark formulation. Pope Eugenius subsequently issued a bull granting crusading indulgences to those who fought the Wends. The result was the Wendish Crusade of 1147, a large-scale military campaign by German, Danish, and Polish forces against the Slavic peoples of what is now northeastern Germany, Poland, and the Baltic coast. The campaign was led by princes including Henry the Lion of Saxony, Albert the Bear of Brandenburg, and Duke Niklot of the Abodrites. The Wendish Crusade was militarily inconclusive. The Crusaders captured some territories and extracted nominal promises of conversion from some Slavic leaders, but the promised mass conversion of the pagan Wends did not materialize. The campaign was as much about German territorial expansion and the ambitions of the German princes as it was about religious goals, a pattern that would characterize many later crusades. Nevertheless, the Wendish Crusade established an important precedent. That crusading was not limited to the Holy Land, but could be directed against any enemies of Christendom, wherever they might be found. This expansion of the crusading concept would have profound consequences for the centuries that followed. Chapter 10. The Reconquista, the Spanish Front. Simultaneously with the Wendish Crusade, another front of the Second Crusade was opening in the Iberian Peninsula, modern Spain and Portugal. The Reconquista, the centuries-long Christian reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim rule, had been underway since the 8th century. By the mid-12th century, the Christian kingdoms of the north, Leon, Castile, Navarre, Aragon, and the nascent Kingdom of Portugal, had been steadily pushing southward, competing with the Muslim Almoravid and Almohad dynasties that controlled the south. When the Crusade was preached in 1146–1147, Pope Eugenius explicitly extended crusading privileges to those who fought the Muslims in Spain. This was a pragmatic acknowledgement of the reality that many potential crusaders, especially those from Portugal, northern Spain, and the regions of France and England closest to the Iberian Peninsula, could serve the crusading cause more effectively closer to home. The most remarkable event of the Spanish front of the Second Crusade was the siege and conquest of Lisbon in 1147. A fleet of crusaders from northern Europe, primarily English, Flemish, Frisian, and German, was sailing to the Holy Land via the sea route around the Iberian Peninsula when they stopped at Oporto in northern Portugal. There, they were persuaded by King Afonso Henriques of Portugal, who was in the process of establishing his kingdom's independence from the Kingdom of Leon, to assist in the siege of Lisbon, then held by the Moors. The siege of Lisbon lasted from July to October 1147 and ended in the city's surrender. The conquest of Lisbon was one of the great military achievements of the Second Crusade era, a genuine and lasting success that transformed the geopolitical landscape of the Iberian Peninsula. Lisbon became the capital of the Kingdom of Portugal, a role it continues to fill to this day. Other campaigns in Spain during this period, notably the capture of Almeria and Tortosa, also achieved significant results, further advancing the Reconquista. Unlike the catastrophic failure of the main crusade in the Holy Land, these Western campaigns of the Second Crusade could genuinely claim success. The Kings Take the Cross, Preparations and Politics. Chapter 11. Louis VII of France, the Pious King. Louis VII of France was a man who had been destined for the Church before the death of his older brother made him heir to the French throne. He was deeply devout, perhaps excessively so by the standards of his age, and his decision to take the cross at Vézelay in 1146 was driven at least partly by genuine religious conviction. But there were also political and personal dimensions to Louis's decision. He had been engaged in a bitter conflict with Pope Eugenius over the appointment of the Archbishop of Bourges, and participating in the Crusade offered a way to restore good relations with the papacy. He also carried a burden of personal guilt. In 1143, during a military campaign in the Berry region, his forces had burned the church of Vitry-le-François with a large number of people sheltering inside, an act that weighed heavily on his conscience and that he desperately wanted to expiate. Louis's queen, Eleanor of Aquitaine, was one of the most remarkable women of the medieval world. Heiress to the vast Duchy of Aquitaine, she was Louis's equal in intelligence and personality, and far exceeded him in political and cultural sophistication. Eleanor famously chose to accompany Louis on the Crusade, a decision that was both bold and controversial. She brought a substantial contingent of Aquitanian vassals with her, adding significantly to the French crusading force. The marriage between Louis and Eleanor was already troubled before the Crusade began. They had been married in 1137, when Louis was 16 and Eleanor was around 15, in a match that brought Aquitaine into the French royal domain. But their personalities were ill-matched. Louis was serious, pious, and somewhat dull. Eleanor was vivacious, politically astute, and interested in the troubadour culture of courtly love that flourished in her native Aquitaine. Their marriage would survive the Crusade but not the decade. It was annulled in 1152, ostensibly on grounds of consanguinity, amid rumors, probably exaggerated by later chroniclers, of Eleanor's alleged misconduct during the Crusade. Chapter 12. Conrad III of Germany, the Reluctant Crusader. Conrad III was the first Holy Roman Emperor from the Hohenstaufen dynasty, and his reign was marked by the bitter conflict between the Hohenstaufen and Welf families that would come to define German politics for generations. Conrad had only been persuaded to take the cross by Bernard of Clairvaux's emotional intervention at Speyer in December 1146, and his commitment to the Crusade was always more fragile than that of Louis VII. Conrad faced significant opposition to the Crusade from his nobles and advisors, who correctly pointed out that leaving Germany for a distant military expedition would create dangerous opportunities for his enemies at home. The rivalry between the Hohenstaufen and Welf factions was intense, and Conrad's absence could easily lead to a breakdown of royal authority. Nevertheless, Conrad honored his crusading vow. He assembled a large German army, estimates of its size vary wildly, but it certainly numbered in the tens of thousands, including large numbers of non-combatants, and began the march east in the spring of 1147. One of the key figures in the German crusading force was Conrad's nephew, the young Frederick of Swabia, who would go on to become one of the most famous emperors in German history, Frederick Barbarossa. Frederick was approximately 25 years old during the Second Crusade, and gained his first major experience of crusading warfare during this expedition. The lessons he learned, both military and political, would shape his later career in profound ways. Chapter 13. The Byzantine Problem, Manuel I Comnenus. Any crusade marching overland to the Holy Land had to pass through the Byzantine Empire. The great Eastern Roman Empire centered on Constantinople, which controlled the Balkans and Anatolia. The relationship between the Crusaders and the Byzantines was perpetually complicated, a mixture of mutual dependence, mutual suspicion, and occasional outright hostility. The Byzantine emperor in 1147 was Manuel I Comnenus, one of the most capable rulers of the Comnenian dynasty. Manuel was a man of tremendous energy and ambition. He wanted to restore the Byzantine Empire to its ancient glory, extending its power both east and west. He was also highly cultured, deeply interested in Western European, Latin customs and traditions, and married to a Western princess, Bertha of Sulzbach, a German noblewoman who took the Byzantine name Irene. Despite these Western connections, Manuel's interests were not always aligned with those of the Crusaders. He was deeply suspicious of the intentions of the great Western monarchs, and with good reason. The First Crusade had seen the Crusaders establish independent principalities on territory that the Byzantines considered rightfully theirs. The Principality of Antioch, in particular, was a perpetual source of tension, as both the Byzantine emperor and the Prince of Antioch claimed sovereignty over the region. Manuel made diplomatic preparations for the passage of the Crusades through his territory, extracting promises from both Conrad and Louis that they would restore any Byzantine territory they conquered and would not act against Byzantine interests. These promises would prove difficult to keep and impossible to enforce. Chapter 14. The Council of Acre and Crusader Politics. While the great armies of France and Germany were preparing to march, the political situation in the Holy Land itself was also in flux. The death of King Fulk of Jerusalem in 1143 had left the kingdom in the hands of his young son, Baldwin III, who was initially co-ruling with his mother, Queen Melisende. The queen was a capable and assertive ruler in her own right, but her regency was a source of political tension. The barons of Jerusalem were divided between those who supported Melisende's continued influence and those who wanted Baldwin to assume full royal authority. The most immediate priority for the Latin East, however, was responding to the threat posed by Zengi's successors. Zengi himself had been murdered in 1146, stabbed to death by one of his own servants while in a drunken sleep, in an event that was greeted with joy by both his Muslim rivals and the Crusader states. But his death did not eliminate the threat he had represented. His son and successor, Nur ad-Din Mahmud, proved to be an even more formidable enemy, and crucially, a more sincere champion of the Islamic cause. Nur ad-Din was everything his father was and more. He was pious, austere, just, and politically brilliant. Where Zengi had used the rhetoric of jihad as a tool of political manipulation, Nur ad-Din seems to have genuinely believed in it. He created a court culture centered on Islamic learning and religious devotion, attracted scholars and theologians to his service, and consistently presented his wars against the Crusaders as acts of religious duty. His combination of military skill and religious legitimacy made him the most dangerous enemy the Crusader states had yet faced. The loss of Edessa had left the Latin East vulnerable and demoralized. The news that massive crusading armies were on their way from Europe was greeted with relief, but also with anxiety. The great lords of the Latin East had learned from bitter experience that Western crusaders could be as dangerous as they were helpful, prone to ignoring local expertise, pursuing their own agendas, and then leaving for home, while the residents had to deal with the consequences of their actions. The March to Disaster, the Overland Campaigns. Chapter 15. Conrad's army moves east, summer 1147. Conrad III set out from Regensburg in May 1147 with his massive German army. The force that assembled was extraordinarily large by medieval standards. Contemporary chroniclers give wildly varying estimates, some as high as several 100,000, though modern historians believe the actual fighting force was more likely in the range of 20 to 30,000, with a much larger number of pilgrims, servants, and camp followers swelling the total to perhaps 60 or 70,000. This huge mass of humanity marched southeastward through Hungary and Bulgaria, both of which were under Byzantine suzerainty, and eventually reached Constantinople. The passage through Byzantine territory was tense but largely peaceful, though there were incidents of pillaging by the Crusaders and clashes with Byzantine forces. Emperor Manuel was relieved to see the German army cross into Asia Minor quickly, and he provided guides and some logistical support. Once in Asia Minor, Conrad made a fateful decision. Rather than following the coastal route, which was safer but longer, he decided to take the direct inland route through central Anatolia, marching toward Konya, ancient Iconium, and then southward toward the Syrian coast. This decision would prove catastrophic. The inland route through Anatolia passed through territory controlled by the Sultanate of Rum, the Turkish state centered on Konya. The Seljuk Sultan Masud I had no intention of allowing a massive crusading army to march through his territory unmolested. His forces shadowed the German army, attacking stragglers, cutting off foraging parties, and denying the Crusaders access to water and food. By October 1147, Conrad's army was in serious trouble. It had been marching for weeks through difficult terrain in the heat of an Anatolian autumn, with dwindling supplies and constant harassment from Turkish cavalry. At Dorylaeum, the same place where the First Crusade had won a great victory over the Seljuks in 1097, the Germans suffered a devastating defeat. Chapter 16. The Battle of Dorylaeum, October 1147. The Second Battle of Dorylaeum took place in late October 1147, near the site where the First Crusade had triumphed half a century earlier. The contrast between the two battles is striking and instructive. In 1097, the First Crusade's forces had been surprised by a large Turkish army but had managed to hold their position long enough for a relief force to arrive and turn the battle into a Crusader victory. In 1147, Conrad's German army, exhausted, hungry, short of water, and strung out over a long march, was similarly attacked by Turkish forces. But this time there was no relief force, no tactical recovery. The Germans were routed. The magnitude of the defeat was staggering. Sources disagree on the exact losses, but it is clear that a very large proportion of Conrad's fighting force was killed or captured. The survivors, including Conrad himself, who was wounded, retreated in disorder back toward the Byzantine coast. The great German crusading army had been destroyed in a single engagement, less than 2 months after crossing into Asia Minor. Conrad himself, nursing his wounds and his humiliation, made his way back to the coast and eventually sailed directly to the port of Acre in the Holy Land, bypassing the disaster of the overland march and arriving with only a fraction of his original force. The disaster at Dorylaeum was a catastrophic beginning for the Second Crusade, but there was worse to come. Chapter 17. Louis VII's army, a different path, similar fate. Louis VII and the French crusading army had set out somewhat later than Conrad, departing from Metz in June 1147. The French route to the Holy Land was broadly similar to the German route, through Hungary and Bulgaria to Constantinople, but the French moved more slowly and with greater attention to discipline and logistics. The French Crusaders arrived at Constantinople in early October 1147, just as Conrad's army was meeting its doom at Dorylaeum. The Byzantine Emperor Manuel received Louis with great ceremony, but the political atmosphere was tense. Manuel had recently concluded a truce with the Seljuk Sultan, which the Crusaders viewed as a betrayal, and news of Conrad's disaster was beginning to filter back, news that Manuel was slow to share with the French king. Louis crossed into Asia Minor in late October and made contact with the remnants of Conrad's defeated army. Conrad himself joined the French force with his surviving troops, a dispirited and battered addition to what was supposed to be the greatest crusading army in history. Louis wisely chose the coastal route rather than the inland route that had destroyed Conrad's army. But even the coastal route through Anatolia was fraught with danger. Turkish forces continued to harass the crusading column, attacking the flanks and rear guard, seizing stragglers, and denying access to water sources. The passage through Anatolia was a prolonged nightmare of attrition. The Crusaders suffered constant losses from Turkish raids, disease, exhaustion, and the harsh winter weather. Discipline began to break down. Quarrels erupted between different national contingents and between the crusading leaders. The critical disaster of the French campaign came at the Cadmus Mountain, modern Hana's Dagi, in January 1148. Louis had divided his army into an advance guard and a main column, with instructions that the advance guard should halt at defensible positions and wait for the main column to catch up before proceeding. But the advance guard, led by Geoffrey of Rankin, a vassal of Eleanor of Aquitaine, failed to follow these instructions. They continued marching past the designated halt point, leaving the main column exposed on the mountain slopes without the advance guard's protection. The result was a disaster. Turkish forces attacked the exposed main column and inflicted severe casualties. The king himself barely escaped. Louis reportedly climbed a tree and used it as a refuge while Turkish cavalry swirled around him. Many knights and foot soldiers were killed or captured. The baggage train, with much of the army's supplies and equipment, was seized. From that point on, Louis made the decision to continue the march to the coast largely by sea. The crusading fleet, which had sailed separately, was able to transport the most important elements of the army. But the foot soldiers and the poorer crusaders had no place on the ships and had to continue the overland march, suffering further terrible losses. By the time Louis VII and the remnants of his crusading army finally reached the port of Italia, modern Antalya, on the Mediterranean coast, the great French army that had set out from Metz 7 months earlier had been reduced by disease, combat losses, desertion, and starvation to a shadow of its former self. Chapter 18: Italia, the Abandonment. The situation at Italia in January 1148 confronted Louis VII with one of the most difficult decisions of the Crusade. Ships were available to transport the army from Italia to the Holy Land, but there were not enough ships to transport everyone. The choice Louis faced was stark. Take the ships with his knights and nobles, the militarily valuable element of his force, and leave the foot soldiers and pilgrims behind, or wait indefinitely for more ships while his army continued to suffer losses from disease and starvation. Louis chose to prioritize the knights and nobles. He left behind a large number of foot soldiers and pilgrims, perhaps 10,000 or more, with some money and a promise that ships would return for them. In fact, ships did not return in sufficient numbers. The abandoned troops were left in a city that was too small to support them, surrounded by hostile territory, and denied access to adequate food and water. Many died of disease. Others attempted to march overland and were killed by Turkish forces or enslaved. Some managed to find passage home by various routes. The abandonment at Italia was a moral catastrophe, a moment when the Crusade's leaders chose military pragmatism over their obligations to the ordinary soldiers and pilgrims who had followed them on crusade. It is a dark episode that deserves more attention than it typically receives in histories of the Crusade. Louis and his knights sailed from Italia to the Holy Land, arriving at the port of St. Simeon near Antioch in March 1148. The Crusade had survived barely, but it had lost an enormous proportion of its fighting strength before it had fired a shot at any Muslim enemy. Intrigue in Antioch and the Council of Acre. Chapter 19: Louis and Eleanor in Antioch, a scandal that shook the Crusade. The arrival of Louis VII and Eleanor of Aquitaine at the Principality of Antioch in March 1148 produced one of the most dramatic and controversial episodes of the entire crusade, a personal and political crisis that generated enormous scandal and contributed to the eventual breakdown of the royal marriage. Antioch was ruled by Aliner's uncle, Raymond of Poitiers, Prince of Antioch since 1136. Raymond was a tall, handsome, charming man, a Gascon nobleman who had made his fortune in the East and who had proved himself a capable ruler of his difficult principality. He was, by all accounts, a man of considerable personal magnetism, and he was Aliner's closest living male relative. Raymond had a clear strategic agenda for the crusade. He wanted Louis to use the French army to help him campaign in northern Syria, specifically to attack Aleppo, the power base of Nur ad-Din, and to recover the county of Edessa. This was militarily sound. Aleppo was the key to northern Syria, and its capture or siege would have relieved pressure on both Antioch and the remnants of the county of Edessa. Aliner supported her uncle's plan enthusiastically. She argued that Louis should follow Raymond's strategic advice and focus the crusade on northern Syria rather than marching immediately to Jerusalem. She was almost certainly correct from a military standpoint. The recovery of Edessa had been the stated goal of the crusade, and Raymond's plan was the most direct way to pursue that goal. But Louis refused. His reasons were a mixture of the personal and the political. He was deeply suspicious of Raymond's suspicions that may have been fueled by jealousy of the obvious rapport between Aliner and her uncle. He was also committed to fulfilling his crusading vow by visiting Jerusalem, the holiest city of Christendom. And he was deeply reluctant to place the French crusading army under the command of a local prince, however strategically capable. The dispute between Louis and Raymond became a full-blown crisis when Aliner announced that she intended to stay in Antioch with her uncle rather than continue to Jerusalem with Louis. This was shocking, a queen abandoning her husband and king in a foreign land. Louis's advisors reportedly had Aliner physically removed from Antioch and forced to accompany the king on his continued march to Jerusalem. The scandal generated by this incident was enormous. Later chroniclers, most notably John of Salisbury, who was with the royal court at the time, and later writers like the chronicler of St. Denis and others, hinted at a romantic or even adulterous relationship between Aliner and Raymond. The charges against Aliner were almost certainly exaggerated or fabricated by hostile sources, but they stuck, and they permanently damaged her reputation and her marriage to Louis. Modern historians generally reject the charges of adultery. Aliner's relationship with Raymond was almost certainly that of a devoted niece and favorite uncle, their closeness reflecting genuine family affection and shared cultural background. Both were from Poitou and Aquitaine, and shared a love of the troubadour culture. But the political fallout was real. Louis's refusal to follow Raymond's strategic advice was a serious error that contributed to the ultimate failure of the crusade. Chapter 20. The Assembly at Acre, June 1148. In June 1148, the leaders of the Second Crusade, Conrad III, Louis VII, and the barons of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, convened an extraordinary assembly at Acre to decide the strategy for the remainder of the crusade. This council, known to historians as the Council or Assembly of Acre, was one of the most consequential gatherings of the crusading era, and it made one of the most disastrously wrong decisions in the history of the Crusades. The council had to decide where to attack. There were several options on the table. Recover Edessa. This had been the stated purpose of the crusade. Raymond of Antioch was still advocating for a campaign in northern Syria, and recovering Edessa would fulfill the Crusade's original mandate. The main obstacle was that Edessa was now firmly in the hands of Nur ad-Din's forces, and a campaign to recover it would require a major commitment of forces to northern Syria, forces that the local barons of Jerusalem were reluctant to commit. Attack Aleppo. Raymond's preferred option, attack the power base of Nur ad-Din and deal a decisive blow to the most dangerous enemy of the Crusader states. This was probably the strategically soundest option, but it would have required close cooperation with Raymond of Antioch, whom Louis distrusted, and it would take the crusading armies far from Jerusalem, the spiritual heart of the enterprise. Attack Ascalon. The coastal city of Ascalon, modern Ashkelon, was held by the Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt and had long been a base for Egyptian raids into the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Capturing Ascalon would significantly improve the kingdom's security on its southern flank. This was a sound strategic objective, but it would not address the threat from the north. Attack Damascus. The most spectacular and ambitious option, an assault on one of the great cities of the Islamic world, the ancient capital of Syria. Damascus was wealthy, prestigious, and had long been a goal of crusader ambition. It was also, crucially, ruled by an independent dynasty, the Barid dynasty, that had maintained a pragmatic, even friendly relationship with the Kingdom of Jerusalem for decades, cooperating with the Franks against their common enemies, including Zengi and his successors. The council chose to attack Damascus. It was a catastrophic mistake. The Siege of Damascus, July 1148. Chapter 21, Damascus, the Rose of the East. Damascus was one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world, a great metropolis of perhaps 100,000 inhabitants, situated in a fertile oasis, the Ghouta, on the eastern slopes of the Anti-Lebanon Mountains. It was a city of ancient mosques and palaces, of bustling bazaars and scholarly academies, of gardens and orchards fed by the waters of the Barada River. Politically, Damascus was ruled by the Barid Atabeg Mujir ad-Din Abak, a relatively weak ruler who depended on the city's own resources and the loyalty of its population to maintain his independence against the growing power of Nur ad-Din to the north. Mujir ad-Din had managed to maintain a careful balance, keeping Nur ad-Din at arm's length while avoiding outright conflict with the Kingdom of Jerusalem to the south and west. The decision to attack Damascus was, from the perspective of the Crusaders, based on several calculations. Damascus was a great prize. Its capture would have been a spectacular triumph, far more impressive than recapturing the already destroyed Edessa. It was potentially vulnerable. Mujir ad-Din's rule was not secure, and a powerful crusading army might be able to take the city by storm or force its surrender. And its position would, if captured, give the Crusader states control of a major strategic crossroads. What the Crusades' leaders apparently failed to fully appreciate was the diplomatic and strategic cost of attacking Damascus. The Barids of Damascus had been allied with, or at least cooperative with, the Kingdom of Jerusalem for years. By attacking Damascus, the Crusaders would 1. Destroy the one major Muslim power that had consistently maintained friendly relations with the Crusader states. 2. Drive Damascus into the arms of Nur ad-Din, who was only too eager to add the city to his domain. 3. Demonstrate to all the Muslim rulers of the region that no accommodation with the Franks was safe, forcing them to seek Nur ad-Din's protection. These were precisely the consequences that followed. Chapter 22. The March to Damascus, July 24, 1148. The crusading army left Tiberias in mid-July 1148 and marched north and east toward Damascus. The combined force included the remnants of the German army under Conrad, the French forces under Louis, and the military resources of the Kingdom of Jerusalem under King Baldwin III. It was a substantial force, probably around 50,000 men in total, though estimates vary. The initial phase of the campaign went well. The Crusaders approached Damascus from the southwest, through the orchards of the Ghouta, the lush garden district that surrounded the city. On July 24, 1148, the crusading army arrived before Damascus. The initial fighting was fierce. Damascus's garrison and citizen soldiers came out to defend the orchards, fighting from house to house and tree to tree. The Crusaders pushed forward with difficulty, eventually establishing themselves in the western orchards near the village of Deria. The orchards provided both shade and water, essential commodities for an army operating in summer conditions, as well as building materials. The dense tree trunks and garden walls could be used as barriers and fortifications. Initially, it seemed as if the Crusaders had chosen their position well. The western orchards gave them access to water and food while keeping the city walls within striking distance. Damascus was surrounded and its defenders were outnumbered. But almost immediately, things began to go wrong. Chapter 23, Nur ad-Din responds. The news of the crusading attack on Damascus spread quickly through the Islamic world. For Nur ad-Din, the attack was both a threat and an opportunity. His primary rival for power in Syria was Mujir ad-Din of Damascus. If the Crusaders conquered Damascus, they would have removed one of Nur ad-Din's most important rivals. But if he could present himself as Damascus's savior, he would win the city's allegiance and add it to his domain without a fight. Nur ad-Din moved quickly. He assembled a large relief force and marched toward Damascus from the north. Simultaneously, his brother Saif ad-Din moved southward from Mosul with additional troops. The two forces converged on the Crusader positions around Damascus with impressive speed. Mujir ad-Din's garrison and the city's citizens were strengthened by the knowledge that relief was on the way. They resisted the Crusader assaults with increasing determination, making every inch of ground costly to take. Inside the crusading camp, a political crisis was developing, one that would ultimately doom the entire enterprise. Chapter 24, The Betrayal, the Move to the Plains. On July 27, 1148, just 3 days after the siege began, the crusading army made a decision that has puzzled and frustrated historians ever since. They abandoned their position in the western orchards and moved to the eastern side of Damascus, to the open plains between the city and the desert. This was a disastrous mistake. The western orchards had provided the Crusaders with water, shade, building materials, and food, all essential for a prolonged siege. The eastern plains had none of these advantages. The ground was open and exposed, offering no protection from the summer sun. There were no nearby water sources, and crucially, the eastern side of Damascus was much better defended. The city's walls on the eastern side were stronger, and the terrain offered no natural cover for besieging forces. Why did the Crusaders make this move? Contemporary and later sources give conflicting accounts, and the truth remains obscure. Several explanations have been proposed. The treachery theory. Some contemporaries and many later historians have suggested that the local barons of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, who were present in large numbers at the Council of Acre and the siege, were bribed by the people of Damascus to abandon the siege. According to this account, Damascus's defenders promised large sums of money and valuable concessions to the local barons in exchange for undermining the siege. The local barons, who would have to live with the consequences of the crusade long after Louis and Conrad returned home, may have calculated that a failed siege was preferable to a successful conquest that would bring Nur ad-Din to their doorstep in force. The rivalry theory. Another explanation focuses on the disputes over who would control Damascus if it were captured. Several of the most powerful barons of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, including Thierry of Alsace, Count of Flanders, who had come on crusade specifically hoping to acquire a lordship in the east, competed fiercely over who would become Lord of Damascus after its conquest. These disputes may have so poisoned relations within the crusading army that coordinated action became impossible. The military necessity theory. Some historians have argued that the move was a genuine military decision, that the Crusaders had received intelligence that Nur ad-Din's relief force was approaching from the north, and that the orchards were indefensible against an attack from that direction. By moving to the eastern plains, the argument goes, they were trying to find a position where they could fight off the relief force while continuing the siege. But the eastern plains were so clearly worse for the siege itself that this argument is difficult to sustain. The coordination failure theory. Perhaps the most plausible explanation is simply that the siege was poorly coordinated from the beginning, that the local barons and the visiting Crusade leaders had different agendas and different time horizons, and that the decision to move reflected a breakdown in communication and command rather than any single conspiracy or error. Whatever the true reason, the consequences were immediate and catastrophic. The Crusaders in their new position on the eastern plains could not sustain the siege. They had no water, their food supplies were running out, and Nur ad-Din's approaching army threatened to trap them between the city walls and the relief force. On July 28, 1148, just 4 days after the siege began, the Crusaders abandoned the siege entirely and retreated. Chapter 25. The retreat and its aftermath. The retreat from Damascus was disorganized and humiliating. Turkish cavalry harassed the retreating army, killing stragglers and inflicting casualties. The Crusaders had nothing to show for their efforts, no prisoners of note, no territories captured, no strategic gains of any kind. They had simply marched to Damascus, established a siege, and then abandoned it. The fallout was immediate and severe. Conrad III, humiliated and angry, left the Holy Land for Constantinople and then returned to Germany, arriving home in the spring of 1149. He took with him his grievances against the Byzantine Emperor Manuel, whom he accused of inadequate support, against the local barons of Jerusalem, whom he accused of sabotaging the Damascus campaign, and against Louis VII of France, with whom he had developed a mutual distrust. Louis VII remained in the Holy Land somewhat longer, making pilgrimages to the holy sites and trying to restore some semblance of purpose to the crusade. But with Conrad gone and the military forces of the crusade depleted and demoralized, there was little Louis could actually accomplish. He finally sailed for home in the late summer of 1149. Raymond of Antioch, who had been left entirely without support during the Crusade's disastrous strategic decision-making, met his end shortly after. In June 1149, he was killed in battle against Nur ad-Din at the Battle of Inab, the same battle that had so concerned Raymond when he was pleading for Louis to attack Aleppo. His head was sent to the Caliph in Baghdad as a trophy. The Second Crusade had achieved nothing in the East, nothing at all. The CONSEQNCES, a world transformed. Chapter 26. The strategic consequences for the Latin East. The failure of the Second Crusade had profound and lasting consequences for the Crusader states in the Holy Land. Most immediately, it accelerated the rise of Nur ad-Din. Mujir ad-Din of Damascus, recognizing after the Crusade that he could not rely on any Frankish help against Nur ad-Din, and that the Frankish princes were capable of attacking him at any moment, eventually capitulated to Nur ad-Din. In April 1154, less than 6 years after the failed siege, Nur ad-Din's forces entered Damascus peacefully. Its ruler had negotiated a handover rather than face a siege. Nur ad-Din had achieved what Zengi never could: the unification of Syria under a single Islamic ruler. With Damascus under his control, Nur ad-Din now ruled a state that surrounded the Crusader states on 3 sides: north, east, and south. The strategic position of the Latin East had been fundamentally weakened, in large part because of the Second Crusade's disastrous decision to attack the one Muslim power that had been maintaining peaceful relations with Jerusalem. The county of Edessa was permanently lost. After the Second Crusade made no serious attempt to recover it, the county was gradually absorbed by Nur ad-Din's forces. By 1150, the Franks' remaining holdings in the region had been surrendered to the Byzantines in exchange for financial compensation, a humiliating acknowledgement that the First Crusader state was gone forever. The military orders, the Templars and Hospitallers, emerged from the Second Crusade with their reputations relatively enhanced, as they had provided much of the disciplined military backbone of the Crusader forces. But the Crusade also demonstrated the limits of the military order's capabilities when confronted with the consequences of strategic blunders by Crusade leaders. The Kingdom of Jerusalem itself entered a period of chronic internal political conflict. The question of whether Baldwin III or his mother Queen Melisende should hold actual power was not resolved until 1152, when Baldwin III finally asserted his authority. But the political divisions and personal rivalries that the Second Crusade had exacerbated, between the local barons and the visiting crusaders, between the monarchy and the great noble families, continued to plague the kingdom. Chapter 27: The European Consequences. In Europe, the failure of the Second Crusade produced a complex mixture of responses. The most immediate was embarrassment and self-examination. How had the greatest monarchs of Western Europe, accompanied by the mightiest armies ever assembled under the crusading banner, managed to achieve absolutely nothing? Contemporary commentators, and there were many from Odo of Duel, who had accompanied Louis and wrote a detailed account of the campaign, to Bernard of Clairvaux himself, struggled to explain the disaster. Bernard of Clairvaux's response to the failure of the crusade he had done so much to inspire was particularly poignant. He did not abandon his faith in the crusading ideal. On the contrary, he argued that the Crusade's failure was God's punishment for the sins of the Crusaders themselves. The soldiers of Christ had been found unworthy of victory. Their moral failures, their greed, their lust, their lack of discipline and faith had caused God to withdraw his favor. This explanation, which may seem self-serving, it allowed Bernard to avoid personal responsibility for the disaster, was nonetheless genuinely believed by many contemporaries. Bernard even began planning a third crusade before his death in 1153, though he did not live to see another major crusading expedition. His legacy was complicated. He had been the driving force behind the Second Crusade, and the Crusade's failure inevitably tarnished his reputation, even as his extraordinary personal holiness and his vast theological writings ensured his eventual canonization in 1174. For Louis VII of France, the Crusade had been a personally transforming but politically damaging experience. He returned to France to find his kingdom in reasonably good order, thanks to the efficient regency of Abbot Suger of St. Denis. But his marriage to Eleanor was effectively over. The couple were granted an annulment in 1152, and Eleanor almost immediately married Henry, Count of Anjou, who within 2 years became King Henry II of England. The political consequences of this remarriage were enormous. Eleanor brought her vast duchy of Aquitaine to Henry, fundamentally altering the balance of power in France and creating the Anglo-Angevin Empire that would dominate Western European politics for generations. For Conrad III of Germany, the Crusade's failure was one disappointment among many in a troubled reign. He died in 1152, leaving his kingdom to his nephew Frederick Barbarossa, who would go on to become one of the most powerful emperors in German history, and who himself would launch the Third Crusade in 1189. Chapter 28: The Islamic World Transformed. The Second Crusade, for all its catastrophic failure from the Christian perspective, was in some ways the catalyst for the Islamic world's most significant transformation since the First Crusade. Nur ad-Din's emergence as the dominant power in Syria was the most immediate consequence, but even more significant in the long run was the career of a Kurdish soldier in Nur ad-Din's service, a man named Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, whom history knows as Saladin. Saladin was born around 1137, the son of a Kurdish military commander. He was educated at Nur ad-Din's court and absorbed the culture of Islamic religious devotion and military discipline that Nur ad-Din had cultivated. When Nur ad-Din sent an expedition to Egypt in 1169, Saladin went along as a junior officer. Through a combination of military skill, political acuity, and fortunate circumstances, he rose to become the effective ruler of Egypt. After Nur ad-Din's death in 1174, He gradually took control of Syria as well, eventually reunifying the Islamic world from Egypt to Iraq under his own Ayyubid dynasty. In 1187, Saladin achieved what Zengi and Nur ad-Din had dreamed of. At the Battle of Hattin, he destroyed the main fighting force of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and 3 months later, he recaptured Jerusalem itself. The Second Crusade's failures had set in motion a chain of events that ultimately led to the loss of the city that the First Crusade had died to take. Chapter 29: The Theological and Cultural Legacy. The failure of the Second Crusade had significant theological and cultural consequences that extended far beyond the political and military spheres. Most fundamentally, it raised profound questions about the theology of crusading itself. If God had inspired the crusade, if Pope Eugenius had issued the call, Bernard of Clairvaux had preached it, and the greatest monarchs of Christendom had led it, why had God allowed it to fail so catastrophically? The failure demanded explanation, and the explanations offered by contemporaries reveal much about 12th century religious thought. As noted above, Bernard's explanation was that the Crusaders themselves were to blame. Their moral failures had cost them divine favor. This was a satisfying answer for those who wanted to preserve the ideal of the Crusade while attributing its failure to human weakness. But it raised uncomfortable questions. If the Crusade's failure was due to the sins of the Crusaders, what did this say about the theology of indulgences that had been used to recruit them? If Crusaders' sins were forgiven, why did those sins cost them the campaign? Other contemporaries were less charitable. Some began to question whether the crusading ideal itself was sound, whether it was truly God's will that Christians should wage war to defend holy places, or whether the violence and bloodshed of the Crusades was incompatible with the Christian gospel. These were minority voices in the 12th century, but they anticipated debates that would grow louder as the crusading movement continued and its failures mounted. The Second Crusade also had important cultural consequences. The experience of crusading, the encounter with the Byzantine world, with the Islamic East, with unfamiliar landscapes, customs, and peoples, contributed to the broadening of Western European intellectual and cultural horizons. Crusaders returned home with new knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy, knowledge derived from the Islamic world, which had preserved and expanded upon the learning of ancient Greece and Rome. This transmission of knowledge was one of the most important long-term consequences of the Crusades, contributing to the intellectual renaissance of the 12th century that laid the groundwork for the later medieval universities and ultimately for the European Renaissance. Key figures and their fates. Chapter 30: The Fates of the Crusades' Principal Actors. Pope Eugenius III continued to face political difficulties in Rome after the Crusades' failure. He was briefly reconciled with the city of Rome and returned to the papal throne before dying in 1153. He was beatified by Pope Pius IX in 1872. Bernard of Clairvaux spent his final years at Clairvaux, continuing his vast correspondence and theological work despite declining health. He died in August 1153, just months after Pope Eugenius. His influence on the Church and on medieval theology was enormous. He was canonized in 1174 and declared a doctor of the Church in 1830. Louis VII of France reigned until 1180, becoming in many ways a more capable king in the second half of his reign than in the first. After his annulment from Eleanor and her remarriage to Henry II of England, he spent much of his energy managing the complex and often hostile relationship with the growing Angevin Empire. He was instrumental in supporting Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, in his conflict with Henry II. He remarried twice and finally produced a male heir, the future Philip II, Philip Augustus, who would become one of the greatest French kings of the medieval period. Eleanor of Aquitaine went on to one of the most extraordinary careers in medieval history. After her annulment from Louis and her marriage to Henry II, She became Queen of England and the mother of two English kings, Richard I, the Lionheart, and John. She was a central figure in the Angevin court's cultural life, a patron of troubadour poetry and literature, and an active political player. In 1173, she encouraged and supported her sons' rebellion against their father, a move that led to her imprisonment for 15 years. She was released after Henry's death in 1189 and spent her final years governing England during Richard's frequent absences on the Third Crusade and in captivity. She died in 1204, aged about 80, one of the most remarkable lifespans and life stories of the medieval world. Conrad III of Germany returned home from the Crusade to find his political position weakened by his absence. He attempted to deal with the Welf opposition, but never fully resolved the conflicts that had plagued his reign. He died in February 1152, before the political consequences of his crusading failure could fully materialize. Frederick of Swabia, later Frederick Barbarossa, learned crucial lessons from the Second Crusade about the importance of discipline and logistics, about the dangers of crusading by large, poorly coordinated armies, and about the complex politics of the Crusader states. These lessons informed his later decision to launch the Third Crusade in 1189, though he himself died during that crusade in 1190, drowning in the Salif River in Anatolia before reaching the Holy Land. Nur ad-Din continued his campaign to unify the Islamic world against the Crusaders, capturing Damascus in 1154 and extending his power throughout Syria and into Egypt. He commissioned the elaborately carved wooden minbar, pulpit, that he intended to place in the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem when that city was recaptured from the Franks, a statement of supreme confidence in the eventual success of his jihad. He died in 1174 without achieving the recapture of Jerusalem, but his work was continued and completed by his successor, Saladin. Raymond of Antioch died in battle at Anab in June 1149, just a year after the Second Crusade's failure. His defeat and death were in large part consequences of the Crusade's failure to heed his strategic advice. His head was sent to the Caliph in Baghdad. His principality survived under his successors, but in a much weakened state. Baldwin III of Jerusalem finally asserted full royal authority in 1152, ending his mother Melisend's regency. He proved to be one of the more capable kings of Jerusalem. Capturing Ascalon in 1153, the target the Second Crusade should perhaps have attacked, and managing diplomatic relations with Nur ad-Din with skill and sophistication. He died childless in 1163. Military analysis: why did the Second Crusade fail? Chapter 31: Strategic Failures. The Second Crusade failed for multiple overlapping reasons, and a comprehensive analysis reveals systematic rather than accidental failure. 1. Strategic incoherence from the beginning. The Crusade lacked a clear and consistent strategic objective. It began with the ostensible goal of recovering Edessa, but by the time the crusading armies reached the Holy Land, this goal had been largely abandoned. The Council of Acre's decision to attack Damascus instead was not based on any coherent strategic logic. It was the product of ambition, rivalry, and poor judgment. The contrast with the First Crusade is instructive. The First Crusade had a clear, if extraordinarily ambitious, goal: reach Jerusalem. Everything else was subordinate to that goal. The Second Crusade's leaders could never agree on a comparable unifying objective. 2. Failure to listen to local expertise. The most valuable strategic advice available to the Second Crusade came from the rulers and barons of the Latin East, men who had spent their lives fighting in the region, and who understood its politics and geography better than any newly arrived European. Raymond of Antioch's advice to attack Aleppo was probably the soundest strategic option available. The local barons' instinct that attacking Damascus was dangerous, whatever their motivations, proved entirely correct. The visiting crusade leaders, Conrad and Louis, consistently ignored or overrode local expertise in favor of their own instincts and agendas. This was a catastrophic failure of strategic judgment. 3. Logistical failures. The overland march across Anatolia demonstrated fundamental logistical failures in both the German and French crusading armies. The provision of food and water for armies of tens of thousands in the Anatolian summer and winter was an enormous challenge, one that the crusading leaders had not adequately planned for. Conrad's decision to take the inland route rather than the safer coastal route was particularly inexplicable. The Crusaders of 1097 had already learned about the dangers of the inland route, and that knowledge should have been available to Conrad's advisors. 4. Political disunity. The Second Crusade brought together multiple powerful leaders, Conrad, Louis, the various princes and barons of the Latin East, who had competing agendas and limited trust in each other. The disputes over command authority, over the distribution of conquered territories, and over strategic priorities undermined the crusade at every stage. The contrast with the First Crusade is again instructive. The First Crusade had its own political conflicts. The rivalry between Bohemond of Taranto and Raymond of St. Gilles was a constant source of tension, but these conflicts were ultimately subordinated to the overriding military necessity of reaching Jerusalem. The Second Crusade never achieved a comparable unity of purpose. The Byzantine factor. The Crusaders' relationship with the Byzantine Empire was poorly managed throughout the Crusade. Manuel I Comnenus was a potential ally who could have provided crucial logistical support, intelligence, and military cooperation. Instead, the Crusaders treated Byzantine territory as a transit zone to be exploited, made promises they could not keep, and generated mutual mistrust that undermined the possibility of genuine cooperation. The Byzantine decision to conclude a truce with the Seljuk Sultan while the Crusaders were passing through Anatolia was a significant blow. It demonstrated that Byzantine and crusading interests were not aligned, and that the Crusaders could not rely on Byzantine support. Chapter 32. Tactical Analysis: The Siege of Damascus. The Siege of Damascus deserves particular attention as a tactical case study in how not to conduct a medieval siege. The decision to besiege Damascus in midsummer was tactically questionable from the start. Medieval sieges were typically most effective in spring or autumn, when the weather was mild enough to allow sustained operations without the heat-related attrition that plagued the Damascus campaign. Operating in the July heat of interior Syria placed enormous physical stress on the crusading forces. The choice of the western orchards as the initial siege position was actually sound. It was the one genuinely good tactical decision the Crusaders made during the entire campaign. The orchards provided shade, water, food, and building materials, and they put the Crusaders within striking distance of the city's most vulnerable sections. Had the Crusaders maintained this position, they might conceivably have been able to sustain a lengthy siege. The abandonment of this position for the exposed eastern plains was the decisive tactical error. Whatever the motivations behind this decision, it immediately negated the Crusaders' most important tactical advantages and placed them in an untenable position. 3 days after making this move, the Crusaders retreated, demonstrating that the move to the eastern plains had been a catastrophic mistake. The failure to maintain a unified command structure during the siege was also a critical tactical weakness. With Conrad, Louis, and the barons of Jerusalem all present, and all effectively claiming authority, decision-making was confused and slow. The rapid tactical deterioration of the siege, the shift from a promising initial position to complete abandonment in just 4 days, reflects this command failure. Broader historical context. Chapter 33. The Second Crusade in the context of medieval crusading. The Second Crusade occupies a complex position in the history of the crusading movement. It is in many ways the pivotal point. The moment when the original optimism of the First Crusade's success gave way to the long cycle of failure, partial success, and eventual complete loss that characterized the later history of the Crusades. The First Crusade had succeeded against all odds, a fact that contemporaries attributed entirely to divine favor, and that later historians have explained in terms of the fortunate disunity of the Islamic world and the extraordinary military qualities of the First Crusade's leaders. The Second Crusade attempted to repeat this success with larger armies and more prestigious leadership, and failed completely. This failure could not be explained by divine disfavor alone. It required a recognition that the circumstances had fundamentally changed. The most important change was the rise of Islamic unity. Zengi and then Nur ad-Din had begun the process of consolidating the fractured Islamic states of the Middle East into a coherent political and military entity capable of coordinated resistance to the Crusaders. This process would be completed by Saladin, and when it was complete, the military balance in the Holy Land shifted decisively against the Crusader states. The Second Crusade also established important precedents for the later history of crusading. The extension of crusading privileges to campaigns in Spain and against the Wends established the principle that crusading was not limited to the Holy Land, a principle that would eventually be extended to campaigns against heretics within Christendom itself, the Albigensian Crusade of 1209, and against political enemies of the papacy, the political crusades of the 13th century. This broadening of the crusading concept was both a response to the difficulties of sustaining Holy Land crusades and a reflection of the Church's increasing use of the crusading machinery as a flexible tool of religious and political policy. Chapter 34: The Second Crusade and Medieval Historiography. The Second Crusade produced a remarkable body of contemporary historical writing that provides invaluable insight into how the Crusade was experienced and interpreted by those who participated in it. The most important primary source is Odo of Jules * de Profession Ludovici VII in Orientum, on the journey of Louis VII to the East, written by a monk who accompanied Louis VII on the Crusade. Odo's account is remarkable for its detailed observation of the lands through which the Crusade passed, including descriptions of Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire that are among the most informative available for the period. It is also remarkable for its frankness. Odo is willing to criticize both the Crusaders and the Byzantines, and his account provides valuable insight into the practical difficulties of the campaign. John of Salisbury, who was at the papal court during the Crusade, provides important context for the political and religious dimensions of the enterprise, including the famous account of Louis and Aliner's dispute in Antioch. Otto of Freising, Conrad III's nephew, wrote an * chronicle that includes accounts of the German Crusade and the famous story of Bernard's emotional appeal to Conrad at Speyer. Otto was a sophisticated historical thinker, influenced by Augustine of Hippo's theology of history, and his account of the Crusade's failure reflects a serious engagement with the theological questions the failure raised. On the Islamic side, the chronicler Ibn al-Qalanisi, a Damascus-based official who lived through the siege of Damascus, provides an invaluable perspective on the Second Crusade from the Muslim point of view. His account of the siege and its abrupt abandonment is crucial for understanding what happened from the defenders' perspective. The long shadow of the Second Crusade. Chapter 35: What Might Have Been. History is not made of might-have-beens, but the historian's task includes understanding the alternatives that were available and why they were not taken. The Second Crusade might have succeeded if its leaders had followed Raymond of Antioch's strategic advice and directed their forces against Aleppo, the power base of Nur ad-Din. A successful siege of Aleppo, or even a prolonged campaign in northern Syria that tied down Nur ad-Din's forces, might have dramatically altered the balance of power in the region. It would certainly have been more consistent with the Crusade's stated goal of recovering Edessa. The Second Crusade might have succeeded if its leaders had chosen Ascalon rather than Damascus as their target for the Holy Land campaign. Ascalon was an Egyptian stronghold without the political complications attached to Damascus, and its capture would have significantly improved the strategic position of the Kingdom of Jerusalem on its southern flank. It was, in fact, captured by Baldwin III just 5 years after the Crusade, suggesting it was a realistic objective. The Second Crusade might have succeeded if its leaders had maintained a unified command structure, listened to local expertise, made better logistical preparations, and maintained the position in the western orchards during the siege of Damascus. But the Second Crusade did not succeed. It failed comprehensively, catastrophically, and instructively. Its failure accelerated the rise of Islamic unity under Nur ad-Din and eventually Saladin, which led directly to the loss of Jerusalem in 1187. It established a pattern of strategic incoherence and political disunity that would characterize many subsequent crusading expeditions. And it forced a rethinking of the entire crusading project, a rethinking that never entirely resolved the fundamental tensions between the Crusade's religious ideals and the political realities of its execution. Chapter 36: The Second Crusade's Place in World History. The Second Crusade is not merely a chapter in medieval European history or in the history of the Islamic Middle East. It is a pivotal episode in world history, one of those moments when the course of events might have gone very differently, and when the decisions made by a relatively small number of individuals had consequences that echoed across centuries. The Crusades as a whole, and the Second Crusade in particular, shaped the relationship between the Christian West and the Islamic East in ways that are still felt today. The memories of the Crusades, of the violence, the territorial claims, the cultural arrogance, remain powerful in the collective memory of many Muslim-majority societies. The very word crusade carries enormous historical and emotional freight in the modern world. At the same time, the Crusades facilitated a transfer of knowledge and cultural exchange that contributed to the intellectual development of both civilizations. The Islamic world's mathematical, astronomical, medical, and philosophical knowledge, transmitted in part through the encounters of the crusading period, fed into the European intellectual renaissance of the 12th and 13th centuries. The Second Crusade was a great failure, but it was a failure of enormous historical significance. Its consequences shaped the medieval world and, through the medieval world, our own. Chapter 37, A Final Reflection. As we close this documentary journey through the Second Crusade, through the fall of Edessa and the preaching of Bernard of Clairvaux, through the disastrous march across Anatolia and the political crisis in Antioch, through the strategic folly of the Council of Acre and the catastrophic abandonment of the Damascus siege, we are left with a story that is simultaneously very far from our own world and very close to it. Very far because the medieval world of 1147, its feudal hierarchies, its absolute faith, its willingness to see military violence as a form of religious devotion, its casual acceptance of slavery and mass killing, is alien to modern sensibilities in important ways. And very close because the human elements of the Second Crusade, the clash of ambitious personalities, the disconnect between rhetoric and reality, the tendency of leaders to prioritize prestige over strategic sense, the way political rivalries undermine military effectiveness, the gap between the ideals that send men to war and the squalid realities of the war itself. These are recognizable in every era, including our own. The Second Crusade was launched with extraordinary ambitions: to recover the First Crusader state, to defend the Holy Land, to demonstrate the power and unity of Christendom. It ended with nothing achieved in the East, thousands dead on the march across Anatolia, a failed 4-day siege of an allied city, and the foundations laid for the eventual loss of Jerusalem itself. It is a story of human ambition, human error, human faith, and human failure, told against one of the most dramatic and consequential backdrops in world history. Thank you for joining us on this deep documentary journey through the Second Crusade. The battle for the Holy Land was never truly won, and the struggle to understand it across the centuries continues still.